Welcome everyone to this first webinar in our series of two, looking back at the year since this very important book was published in 2020. And this webinar is one of the ways in which NORRAG fulfills its mission to produce, disseminate, and broker critical knowledge on topical issues in education and development, in order for us to be able to contribute to enhancing the conditions for participatory, informed, and evidence-based policy decisions to improve the equity and quality of education. And here, with this very important book on grading goal 4, we are extremely pleased to be partnering here with Antonia Wulff, who is the Director of Research, Policy and Advocacy at Education International. So thank you all very much for coming. We're very much looking forward to what promises to be a very exciting discussion this afternoon. Antonia.
Thanks so much, Moira, and a warm welcome from my side as well to each and all of you. It's great to see so many of you with us today, and it's also great to see how many corners of the globe that we have represented with us here today. That's a great starting point for the conversation. And I'm saying that particularly because one of the things that we wished to do with this book was really kick off a more critical and a more thoughtful conversation about SDG 4 as the overarching global framework for education and development. And you could really say that the book is a call to the education community to really have a more critical look at what the current education agenda actually includes, to scrutinize some of the power dynamics, the powerful people, interests, organizations behind the goal, somehow involved in relation to the goal, and really aiming to build capacity that we need to be able to not just implement this agenda, but also monitor its implementation and really keep that critical focus on how it's going and where we are going. So this webinar is really, it's a call to each and all of you joining us today to engage with us, to ask those critical questions, including in the questions box here on Zoom. When SDG 4, what I'm going to do before we hand over to our panelists is talk a bit about some of the structural challenges that shape SDG 4. And I'm going to focus on accountability on the one hand and on financing on the other. I'm going to do it pretty briefly because then we want to focus on 3 of the chapters in the book. But what I wanted to start by doing is really pull us back to 2015, when the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, were adopted, and they were hailed as incredibly ambitious, as transformative even, that's also what they call themselves, and they were criticized for being overly ambitious, criticized for just being impossibly broad in scope, and just a bit unreasonable for being so many goals, so broad goals. And at the same time, they were hailed for being radical, exactly because they were so ambitious. And I think that's the starting point for the book as well, that these goals, including the education goal, they do have the potential to be transformative. And the level of ambition is in itself a really exciting and an absolutely necessary recognition of the fact that the right to education includes all levels of education, that there needs to be a continuum of quality education, And it recognizes that interconnectedness that shapes development as well as education more specifically. So just the way that you can't talk about quality without also looking at equity, the way you can't talk about social development without also considering environmental, economic, so on and so on. So that's our starting point. The problem is that, of course, this agenda, while aiming to be transformative, it was adopted by those who were in power in 2015. And that means that we ended up with an intriguing and a frustrating mix of a very, very ambitious agenda, looking at the targets across the 17 goals, and a very, very weak accountability framework and a complete absence of financing commitments. And I guess some would even say that talking about an accountability framework is a bit silly because it doesn't really come close to being that. As we entered this new decade, the United Nations declared that it would be a decade of action and delivery. These last 10 years of the SDG period would be the period when it all happened. Then, only a few months into the new decade, the pandemic hit and the situation was changed. The UN was quick to declare that actually we made more progress towards the SDGs, the world would have been better prepared, in a better place to deal with the pandemic and all of its consequences. While that, of course, is true, I would argue that the progress envisaged was undermined much, much before the pandemic hit. And I think that's crucial for us to consider as we now try to look at how implementation can be strengthened and sped up as we continue this so-called decade of action and delivery. So what characterizes the SDGs is that all of the implementation is voluntary and it's country-led. These are two words that pop up quite a few times in the Agenda 2030 document that was adopted in 2015. And what it really means is that there are no specific implementation modalities. There are no agreed financing arrangements behind these goals and targets. Governments are expected to adapt the goals to their national contexts. And while that's absolutely crucial and a kind of precondition for relevant education, relevant development policy, it of course also opens up for a kind of cherry-picking approach to the SDGs, where governments can choose if, when, how they implement a given target within SDG 4 and within the SDGs more broadly. It also, importantly, opens up for international organizations to do quite some cherry picking in terms of how they choose to implement SDG 4. So you can have an international organization, for instance, that chooses to focus on literacy and numeracy rather than on teachers, just to take one example that we might come back to. What we've ended up with is in some ways a free-for-all situation where anyone doing anything that is slightly related to education can claim to be contributing to SDG 4. Many argue that this is great and it will result in more implementation. What it definitely results in is a very, very differentiated approach to SDG 4, and particularly the values and the principles that underpin goal and its targets. And what this really does is contribute to a renegotiation of the role of the state, governments as the duty bearers of the right to education, by somehow suggesting that all implementation is equally important, all stakeholders have equally important roles to play. And it's interesting, actually, if you read Agenda 2030 and you look for kind of commitments that would be ascribed to governments, it's much, much easier to find sentences about all stakeholders where governments are mentioned as one of very many different stakeholders than any commitments to the specific role and obligations of governments. And of course, there's a lot to be said about the broader context, the fact that the SDGs, they have in many ways coincided with a kind of shift in how we view development, where we've started to look at development in much, much more results-based and impact-driven ways, which means that you may end up in a situation where the who and the how is seen as less interesting, less important, as long as there are results. So to take a very simplistic example, as long as kids are learning, it doesn't matter who's providing the education or who's paying for the education, because the important thing is to make sure that everybody is learning. But by ignoring sources of funding, providers of education, you do risk depoliticizing not just education, but development more broadly speaking. And fundamentally, what you risk doing is delegitimizing the concerns of the people who want education, who have a right to education, the people who work within education, by shifting the conversation and shifting the attention. And of course, when you shift the attention, you also shift your understanding of who's in charge and who's to be blamed if things don't work. So this is a very broad context in which the pandemic hit, in which COVID-19 ended up exacerbating and deepening some of the problems that this book look at. And I think that is the starting point. COVID-19 hasn't brought about new problems as much as it's deepened and exacerbated existing problems, particularly in relation to equity, quality, and the kind of tensions around public and private responsibilities as well as interests. And what you could say is that today we will continue the conversation. We will see whether this is the case or whether there are actually new additional challenges brought about by COVID. We do know that there has been an increase in child labor for the first time in many years, and that many of the groups that have been excluded from education and are now unlikely to come back to education are the groups that we have worked for decades to include, exactly because of their marginalized status in their societies. We know that the concerns around quality, the so-called learning crisis, the lack of quality in education across the globe, that's at the center of the debate as we're now discussing learning loss, as we are discussing the support structures to put in to support teachers on the one hand and to support students on the other hand. And we know that we are in an economic situation that is increasingly challenging because of the pandemic. I saw some IMF projections that were talking about 154 countries making budget cuts in 2021. And I think the number of countries was expected to be slightly higher in 2022. So fiscal deficits and debt levels growing, and that being a crucial challenge as we hope to speed up and to improve the implementation of SDG 4. I'm going to finish here because what we really want to do is hear from our panelists. We have 3 of the chapters of the book represented here today. And we're going to kick off with William C. Smith, who's co-authored a chapter with Aaron Beneveau. And this is a chapter that's really looking at the learning crisis, the so-called learning crisis that was at the heart of the process that led up to the adoption of SDG 4. And as I said, is a crisis that's stayed with us, at least in terms of occupying a central position in the whole global conversation about education and education within and beyond the pandemic. So I'm going to give William the floor, and while you listen, I'd invite you all to consider any questions, comments that you'd like to be making. We're going to take 1 or 2 questions directly after Will's presentation before we then move on with the 2 other presentations. So keep the questions coming, and Will, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Antonia and NORRAG, for having me. It's great to see so many people here. So I'm Will Smith. I'm at the University of Edinburgh, and as Antonia mentioned, this is an extension from a chapter we did for this book with Aaron Beneveau. And we're trying to really see global learning metrics and learning metrics generally. How are they illustrated in this pandemic? So I wanted to give a little bit of context first for what are we trying to do in this chapter before I move on to how do we see some of the pieces in this chapter play out during the pandemic. So the goal for the chapter, and I think the link is in the chat box, so feel free to read all the chapters, they're all wonderful, is to critically explore the legitimation of global learning metrics in relation to this global learning crisis that helped fuel the SDGs, the expansion of national and cross-national assessments that have been happening for really the last 30 years, and the Sustainable Development Goal for education. And our hope is to draw attention to some of these likely unintended consequences with a real focus on equity. So starting off with what is a global learning metric, not all of you may be familiar with this term. There's not really a clear definition of what a global learning metric is, but it generally refers to a single global scale in which measures of learning from different standardized assessments are placed. And oftentimes this is thought as a ladder where you've got highly proficient at the top and very low proficiency at the bottom. And we're trying to place things on this kind of ladder. There have been lots of attempts to build a global learning metric to capture the global indicator for SDG 4.1. And you should be familiar with that. That's the one that gets a lot of attention. It's the proportion of young children and young people in grades 2 to 3 into primary and the end of lower secondary that are meeting minimum proficiency in reading and math by sex. And when you look at the creation of SDG 4 and the global indicators, you see this gets a ton of attention and has a lot of resources pumped into it. And that's probably best captured by looking at how this global indicator has shifted relative to the global indicator for 4.7, which captures a lot of the human rights, equity, education, sustainable development, more holistic, humanistic aspects of SDG 4. Both indicators started at a tier 3 indicator, meaning we didn't really know how to measure fully either of these indicators. But within the first 5 years, this is the only indicator in SDG 4 to have moved to a tier 1 indicator, meaning we're ready to go now. We've got a way to measure this. And that just demonstrates all the attention and resources been pumped into this in part to capture the global learning crisis. So there are some core beliefs that are associated with the global learning metric. First is that all countries should take nationally representative assessments. And that could be at the national level, although there's a lot of conversations on whether or not national level assessments are of the standard necessary to provide comparable information. So there's a lot more encouragement to take part in these cross-national large-scale assessments. And that's desirable by buying these different results that are nationally representative onto a single global scale. And importantly, there's also a sense that this can be done independent of national context, that these are all comparable measures, we can put them on a single global scale, and that's appropriate. So when we look at efforts to create a global learning metric, really in the last 5 years, there have been official efforts to create a global learning metric for SDG 4.1. These have been led by UNESCO's Institute of Statistics and the Global Alliance to Monitor Learning under the guidance of UIS. They have recently created a global proficiency framework, and that is that kind of ladder approach where you've got, you look at reading, you look at math, and you say, okay, what is advanced proficiency for this grade for reading? What is advanced proficiency for math? And you try to go through and really match different assessments onto this proficiency framework. And there are 3 ways that this is now happening. And these are rapidly changing and being adapted and being updated to the point where this isn't really fully captured in the chapter. It's captured in a different chapter that me and Aaron have done. So there are 3 ways that we are linking and connecting assessments to this ladder proficiency or global proficiency framework. The first is statistical recalibration, the top, and that is really just trying to statistically create equivalence between national assessments and this framework. So you've taken a national or international assessment, a regional assessment. What is the score of, let's say, SACMEC relative to TIMSS? And let's see if we can statistically see an equivalence. The 2 other approaches are kind of secondary approaches focusing on countries that have taken national assessments. Policy linking is probably the most time-consuming and quite challenging approach, and that's where we've got an expert group of individuals that are sitting down with their national assessment and looking question by question, how do the questions in their national assessment meet and match up with the global proficiency framework? And then statistical linking is sometimes called the Rosetta Stone approach, and it is saying, let's take from the global proficiency framework a bank of test items that countries could then place into their national assessments, and we can then take all the answers to those test items, put them together, and put them on the global proficiency framework. So that's the official efforts right now to create a global learning metric from SDG 4.1. There are other efforts or alternative global learning metrics put out by other large international organizations. We're all familiar with PISA and the OECD. The World Bank, though, in the last 2 to 3 years, come up with what some would argue are competing learning metrics. And so the 2 that I'm going to talk about a little more today are learning adjusted years of schooling. And this uses the statistical recalibration approach, that type of linking regional assessments with international assessments, so we can put them all in one scale. And they use learning adjustment years of schooling as part of the World Bank's Human Capital Index. And the other one is their learning poverty indicator. So these are the efforts to create a global learning metric, all fairly recent. And when I think about this and learning metrics overall in the COVID era, what am I seeing? So from my perspective, I'm really seeing a reinforcement of a utilitarian, economistic view of education, okay, where we're doing education for an end, but education is not an end in itself. And to me, this also demonstrates the strength of what I've talked about before as a global testing culture. And this is the sense that we have this kind of taken for granted notion that test scores are really the same as quality, and that we're going to use these to drive policies and practices. And underlying this global testing culture is a strong belief in numbers. So Akira talked in 2018 as tests becoming a virtue in and of themselves. And Peterson and colleagues in 2016 talks about how numbers in education can be transformed from representatives of education into education per se. So I wanted to talk about learning loss, because these are the big global headlines we see. We see things like 101 million more grade 1 to 8 students are below proficiency. Or the COVID generation is going to lose up to $10 trillion in lifelong earnings, or another 72 million children can fall into learning poverty. And once again, very much in this crisis narrative. So looking at each of these, it's important to see that all of these are underlined by a global learning metric. And to some extent, COVID has provided an opportunity to really embed a global learning metric into this larger discourse of education. So for example, the 101 million more grade 1 to 8 students below proficiency is a UIS estimate that's directly tied to the global proficiency framework. We can see here part of how they're calculating that. We can see at the bottom, this is you can talk about that as the framework. So what is proficiency? Let's talk about an international threshold, and let's see how we can estimate changes and who's going to meet that threshold relative to the global proficiency framework. And they've done this, and you can look at that Montoya and Gustafson for more technical stuff. But it's important to also understand that this is really based on reading in grade 3 only, not grades 1 to 8. They take reading grades 3 and basically multiplied it by 8 to get to the 101 million. And they're using the percentage of contact time lost to estimate a reduction in what was previously maximum assumed gains each country can make in percentage points. Other learning loss headlines, also tied to global learning metrics. We can see the COVID generation to lose up to $10 trillion in lifelong earnings. And here, this is directly tied to the learning adjusted years of schooling. And so once again, this is directly tied to international and regional assessments that not all countries have taken, that only include in-school learners and only focus on a few subjects. And so they've said, okay, we estimate, this is in June before we knew anything, we estimate worst case scenario that schools will close for 7 months. And if our prior calculations are correct, this would lead to a 0.6 reduction in learning adjusted years of schooling. And therefore, when we put that into the human capital index, we assume that that reduction is equated with about $16,000 per student in lifetime earnings, and we multiply that up to get to 10 trillion. The final big headline is this 62 million children can fall into learning poverty. And once again, that's also tied to a global learning metric. That's directly tied to their learning poverty indicator at the World Bank. And the learning poverty indicator says we're going to look at 10-year-olds and assessment outcomes for 10-year-olds. We're going to look at those that aren't proficient and those that aren't in school, and we're going to add them up, and we're going to say everybody who's not in school and everybody who's not proficient is in learning poverty. And so once again, in June, they estimated that there's going to be a 10% increase in learning poverty in their most pessimistic scenario. So once again, schools are going to be closed for 70% of the year. There's going to be low mitigation. There's going to be no remediation when they open. And that's how we get to 72 million children possibly falling into learning poverty. So that's the first piece that I'm seeing from COVID that's related to learning metrics. The second piece is this embedded global testing culture and what I talk about as exam obsession. And so this is looking at UNESCO surveys of national offices on how have nations changed their high stakes exams or assessments during COVID. And so here we can see just on the x-axis, On the x-axis, the number of countries and what's changed. And what we can see here is really countries clinging to their assessments. They're postponing it. They're saying, regardless of the COVID pandemic, we're going to maintain in-person assessments. We're going to move them online. We're going to reduce the number of exams. But occasionally, there are some alternative approaches to exams and learning validation that were been offered. Most of the time, we see this kind of clinging to the exams. We also saw prioritization of exams and the return to in-person teaching. So UNESCO has talked about teaching from school premises was more frequent for teachers in upper secondary, and especially for those helping to prepare their students for national examinations, which is not associated with any type of public health recommendation at all. It doesn't make sense for us to suddenly prioritize years 9 or years 12 when we know that older children are more likely to get and spread the virus. So some of these alternative ideas also demonstrated how deeply embedded our reliance on testing and numbers is. So some countries have tried to do teacher predicted grades, for example, in the United Kingdom and Hong Kong, but these were seen as less reliable and more subjective, where we want the objective, more reliable numbers of testing. And it did highlight some concerns of discrimination by teachers, but it also highlighted a real lack of trust in teachers. And I know those are related, but I would say instead of discarding teachers as the one that's seeing students every day and has the best understanding of their abilities, we should work to remove discrimination from amongst teachers. So, global learning metrics in COVID. This is similar to the global learning crisis narrative, where learning loss really provides a simplistic proclamation that's out of context, and it doesn't really provide any actionable insight for those that need to shift and adjust education following the crisis. So the learning metrics during COVID continued to narrow the focus to certain subjects. So moving away from the more holistic, idealistic approaches that we came into SDG 4 hoping for. It values academic knowledge over other types of knowledge. Right, so this is just school-based, it's just formal education. And we might want to go in to classrooms and ask our students, what did you learn this past year? Because my guess is they don't say nothing. There's something important in the life skills that they've learned this last year. And we should be recognizing that all knowledge doesn't come from the classroom. And finally, and importantly, learning metrics during COVID continue to marginalize out-of-school children. All of the learning loss, whether it's these global measures or whether we're looking at learning loss studies in the Netherlands or the UK, entirely omits out-of-school children. They are all school-based assessments. And so this is especially important to pay attention to the most disadvantaged because they are the ones less likely to return following the pandemic. Okay. I think that is it from me. I'm looking forward to any comments or questions.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Will. You've raised so many issues that I'm sure I'm not the only one who's sitting here with loads of possible questions popping up. We would like you to add your questions in the chat, if possible. And there's a few questions already around trust and how that trust can be reinstated. That's a big question, but I think if we start with that one, Will, and then we'll see if there's other questions coming in.
Okay, so starting with, sorry, I'm getting, let me stop sharing. There we go, there's everybody. Much easier to see everyone now. Okay, so looking at trust and yeah, a lack of trust in teachers from who. So I think what we need to be doing here is looking at really how I think there's been this interesting, I guess, contrast between we don't trust teachers, but we give them more responsibility. And that's part of what I've seen as kind of the increasing responsibilization of teachers over the years, where now part of the arguments against school closures was, well, that's where students get their food, and that's where they get their healthcare, and that's where they get their security. And it's weird to think about education doing all these things and teachers responsible for all of that. So I think when we think about trust in teachers, part of it is thinking about, you know, what are their real responsibilities, I think would be a starting point, and making sure that we have social structures to provide food, provide security, provide psychological support for students. That's not all on teachers, because I think that weighs them down. But also the sense on, you know, I think recognizing not just their responsibility, but what else contributes to this, getting away from some of these simplistic arguments, discussions in the media. I think that's also fueling some of this. So it's really tough. I think conversations like this and what else contributes to learning loss within this situation is really important to situate teachers appropriately within an educational system.
That's great. And I'm thinking here that maybe Stephanie and Bilal, who will talk about teachers later, you might want to address this question as well. A last question, there's lots of them in the chat, but I'm going to highlight one around holistic indicators and whether you think that would be a solution to this narrow current focus. And if so, how they might be integrated and measured.
Antonia, sorry, can you repeat that? What was the intervention?
Holistic indicators, whether that would be the solution and how, if so.
I mean, I think, you know, we've talked in SDG4 about this need for stuff like social emotional learning, education, sustainable development, and all these other more holistic pieces. And it's part of the big challenges of this continued reliance on assessments is that, you know, it is still math and reading. So I think, you know, I showed on this slide this kind of contrast between the French response and the UK response, and I contributed to that article and was talking about really when exams were canceled in France, they went to a portfolio style approach, which does provide a lot more flexibility in the types of knowledge you can value and the types of evidence students can provide to demonstrate their learning. And I think, you know, when we think about the big variety of approaches to learning and to demonstrating information and knowledge out there, and we think about those that are more tactical and so forth, it's important that we recognize the diversity of learners we have and we're able to capture that. So I do think there's some approaches that we can take away from a reliance on exams to demonstrate all students can do to some of these other approaches that have provided an opportunity here. I mean, I think, and I think I forgot to share my final slide actually. My final slide was talking about reimagining, and there are some conversations here about, do we need exams now? You know, we've gone a year, some people have gone 2 years without it. Is this an opportunity for us to think about other ways to value learning and recognize other types of knowledge? So hopefully.
Great, thanks, Will. There's loads of other questions, but I am afraid we will have to move on to our next presentation. That will be Elaine Unterhalter, who will discuss higher education in COVID-19. Higher education was included in SDG 4, pledging to ensure equal access to higher education. That was a hard-fought battle, and many governments were very grumpy about it being included. Question is, where are we now, 6 years after the agenda was adopted and more than a year into a pandemic. Elaine will draw on the chapter that she co-authored with Stephanie Allais, Colleen Howell, Valesa Molebazzi, and Lerato Porcioli. Elaine, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Antonia, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of this panel. In the year since Antonia's book was published, I've largely sat at my desk in my son's room, and I've tried to connect with some of the visions about education that the book articulated and tried to sketch. I've tried to think about SDGs, about Build Back Better, Build Back Equal. And I think I was able to do this because in relative comfort and with financial security, because I was working for a well-resourced university. And one of the things I've done over this year is read about the grim harvest of debt, depression, substance abuse, exacerbating inequalities, sexual, racial, and ethnic violence, bereavement, illness, trauma, and grief. And there's something incredibly unsettling about the university space. It's not an ivory tower, it's an electronic sound booth in a way, in which we're separated from all the things that we want to change. And so in trying to think about this presentation, I'm kind of wanting to capture that notion. Where are we in higher education? Can we do justice to the enormous challenge the pandemic has given us, which sharpens the challenge of the SDGs, but also places once more this complicated relationship of higher education and the relative privilege of those who work and teach in it in relation to the enormous tasks to be done. How do I move my slides forward? Oh dear, sorry everybody. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I'm building from the, thank you. I'm building from the chapter as Antonia outlined in the book, where we brought out how universities are historically associated with elites and posed the question of, can they be nudged to engage more equitably, play a role in support of what we call intrinsic and instrumental notions of the public good, and changing the inequalities and working for a more holistic vision of development. And what the chapter does is it looks at the indicators and some of the text in SDG 4.3, the target on higher education, which is about access, affordability, and quality. And it's a slightly queasy dynamic in that text, because are we interpreting quality as quality for the people who have access and for whom it is affordable, or are we interpreting a more holistic vision of quality? And we talk in the chapter about the need for different metrics, which is, I think, one of the issues Will has raised, and which I could come back to in response to a question, because the way in which the metrics drive the aspiration, I think, is a problematic one in relation to higher education. There could be a bigger vision, but the metric is constantly reducing the vision. So what I want to draw on a little bit in this presentation is both thinking beyond the work in the chapter, and also some of the work I've done sitting at my desk in this soundproofed cocoon, which has been a lot of systematic literature reviews and trying to look at the literature on higher education and development, and also higher education in relation to disasters and previous pandemics. This is the conceptual diagram for a rigorous review I did with Colleen Howell and Moses Oketch, looking at higher education and the outcomes of development. I'm not going to talk through it in any depth, but what I want to alert you to is that the multiple functions of higher education, so teaching, research, innovation, engagement with communities, and also on the right-hand side of the diagram where we sketch the range of development outcomes, and we've shaded these because we want to show that higher education can have positive development outcomes or very negative development outcomes. And the literature is suggesting both of those. So higher education is not automatically going to address the inequalities and exclusions and hierarchies and vulnerabilities that the pandemic has highlighted and that the SDGs were set out to address. But it has the potential, and it's that question of how do you build the potential that I think is so tricky. One of the issues I think we want to talk about is higher education being both instrumental to realizing other SDGs, both the wider vision of SDG 4 as well as the wider vision of all the SDGs, but also that there's something that we call the intrinsic quality of higher education, that quality of debate, of critique, of evaluation of data, and of people mixing from a range of different places, and that both of those elements in my mind are important, and that the latter one has been particularly placed under strain by COVID because of the electronic format of the way we've had to interact with each other. But there's a lot of literature, even before COVID, of how tertiary education was inadequately or poorly connected with the SDG 4 vision, that very many case studies showing that research didn't address local problems, that teacher education wasn't adequate to the need, or teachers weren't prepared for the needs of the children they actually had to teach rather than the imagined children they thought that the teacher education syllabus in higher education thought they would be teaching. And so that misaligned connection has always been a problem for higher education. But I also want to strike a note of caution in that the literature on higher education and development outcomes is very skewed towards the wealthiest countries, the OECD countries, to the wealthiest low and lower middle income countries. So there's much more literature. The wealthier the country, the more we know about their higher education system and whether they connect with learning with the development needs or not. And so the potential of higher education to meet the needs of the SDGs is needs as formulated in the SDGs is inadequately studied, and the research is inadequately acted on. So I think the argument I'm going to make is there is a need to in building on the experience of the pandemic. There's a need not to abandon the commitment to work on higher education, but to think about strengthening with much better support to a holistic vision around the SDGs, build back better, build back equal, or I also talk about build back careful, repositioning the importance of psychological and emotional and care support that the pandemic has highlighted as being so important. Context was, in the chapter we wrote, incredibly important. I think it remains absolutely crucial to any other way we're going to think about higher education in relation to the SDGs. And it's the particular, the positive examples on that diagram where we were sketching them from the rigorous literature reviews I've done, and I've done 2 over the last year. It's the collaborative relationships and partnerships that are facilitated either through teaching and learning or through research partnerships that pay attention to contextual complexities and partnership. That seems to be what higher education would be good at and can be good at, and is important to sustain in the wake of the pandemic. So the conclusion I wanted to bring out is, again, like Will's, I think, something about changing the narrative. We need to change the narrative that higher education is going to make us rich, either individually or countries rich in money. What it can do is make us rich in connecting with each other and make us rich in understanding the world and a shared sense of vulnerability. I think it's really important that we up our skills to do real-time research and keep that in dialogue with a form of scholarly reflection. The ways in which we do research are tied to global hierarchies and are tied to forms of performance that do not address well the vulnerability and the urgency. And the literature on disaster recovery gives us these 2 concepts, which I find useful and maddening. The one is they talk about mitigations, and the second is they talk about adaptations. And the problem with the notion of mitigations is, I think, just the kind of problem that the education community faced in relation to the learning crisis, or kind of confronted but evaded. A mitigation is seen as a little pellet. It's just something you can do. But that's something you can do. I'm going to tell you one of the things I have found very interestingly that it feels we can do. But we need to get away from the notion that it's only mitigations that will support us, and think about how the higher education sector can adapt to recognize this range of vulnerabilities, range of inequalities, and the range of ways of connecting and supporting people, both in recovering from this terrible pandemic and in trying to deliver on the SDG vision. There are 3 very, very interesting studies on higher education and whether it's affordable or not after terrible disasters. The earthquake in Italy, Hurricane Katrina, and one of the HIV as a pandemic. And one of the clear findings from a whole range of economists who've looked at this is that setting affordability against access makes no sense. The only way students complete their degrees is if you give them money. Give students money, give them adequate amounts to live on, and they will finish their degrees. No merit-based scholarships, no particular kinds of loans. So the wording of SDG 4.3, which says access to affordable higher education, dichotomizes access and affordability. And I think that's a problematic set of ideas. And I want us to challenge that and think about, if we want higher education and we want it as a large, well-resourced sector, it must be paid for. And one of the things the pandemic has showed us is once you want money, it's there for the people who want it for the things they want. You know, that austerity agenda, rich countries are not speaking austerity anymore. So it's puzzling why austerity and meanness continues to characterize the global agenda. The second point I want to stress is that quality in higher education is instrumental and intrinsic to coming through a pandemic and through any kind of recovery. So a real huge push around what is quality and how quality links with equality. And the third thing I want us to think about is to think about SDG 4.3 as a means of implementation. You know, the SDGs have this funny division between you have 7 or 8 targets, and then there are 3 things that are the means of implementation. And the means of implementation are considered almost, well, they were meant to be strong, but because the targets are slightly, make them sort of second rank in a funny kind of way. But it seems to me that SDG 4.3 and as a means of implementation for the whole SDG program, as well as any post-pandemic vision, seems to me incredibly important. And I think that's my last slide, and I'll stop there. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks, Elaine. And an encouragement to all of you to put your questions in the chat. We've had one question about the shift to online learning and whether that was easier within tertiary education than compulsory schooling. And it strikes me, your reflections on building back careful as maybe something that you could reflect on in relation to this question as well, considering that higher education has been closed for a longer time in many countries as well.
Well, yeah, I've waded through dozens and dozens of reviews of literature on online learning in higher education. And I've looked at it, a lot of it is in the health sector, but there is quite a bit in the education sector and on online teacher education. Everybody who seems to write this literature is enthusiastic about online education. It doesn't seem to be associated with students performing less well in anything other than the most rote learning tasks. It seems to encourage better and more thoughtful responses in essays and response to exam questions. It seems to give students a wider network of support, and it seems to encourage teachers to be more creative and more innovative in the range of ways in which they communicate with students. That's what the literature says. I must say, having spent a year doing online teaching myself, I just miss students so much. I miss the informality, the face-to-face encounters, the humanness that is so reconfigured through online education. So I remain, it's half full, half empty. It's been efficiently delivered. And I think because it's a more elite group in higher education, all the issues about exclusion of the poorest have not arrived in the same way, which is not to say they have not arrived, because the mental stress, the stress of people moving homes, the stress of people not being able to afford the right software or the right, all of that exists, and higher education is as stratified as ever. So I think all of that needs to be baked into the analysis before we become cheerleaders for, the technological revolution. But I think even if it is the case that a whole range of things might be able to be delivered adequately in higher education, through online learning, it doesn't remove the onus on universities and the tertiary education sector to connect better with the people who are most in need and say, what are the skills we can develop together to address that? I mean, I hope I've answered, Alexandra. Antonia.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We've also had some research from teachers in primary and secondary education talking about how online teaching is challenging for anything that isn't cognitive, and how it reduces that emotional connection, and how it fundamentally makes the teaching less rewarding, and which in turn then has raised all kinds of questions around the teaching profession and what the more long-term impact will be on the profession. And I'm going to sneakily use that as a bridge to jump to the next presentation, because we are running out of time. Not to stress anyone, but we are going to turn our attention to the teacher chapter within the book. This is a chapter that Stephanie and Bilal will present and reflect upon. They've co-authored the chapter with Mamusu Kamanda and Joe Aylwood. And this is beautifully building on Elaine's presentation, also in the sense that the teacher target 4.C within SDG 4 is, of course, one of these famous means of implementation targets. So originally presented as a precondition for any of the other targets to be successfully met. And I guess Stephanie and Bilal are questioning this. I'm not going to take the words out of your mouths, but just hand you the floor.
I probably need to share my screen. Sorry, too many buttons.
In the meantime, I'll start with introductions. Thank you very much, Antonia. I'm Bilal Barakat, Senior Policy Analyst with the Global Education Monitoring Report, and I'll be presenting after Stephanie.
Hi, and I'm Stephanie Bankson, Program Specialist at IAEP UNESCO. And I think I can speak for both of us when I say that we were very privileged to be included in this wonderful, important book, and then also to have this opportunity, I think, to reflect 1 year on since the publication of the book. Of course, as Antonia mentioned earlier, I think COVID-19, it was a bit of a high stakes test for all of us, and honestly, not sure we're doing so well. And I think one of the big issues that we're faced with is this discussion around these human aspects of education, of the relationships between people, all of that we miss so much in this online setting. And I think that's really going to be at the heart of what we'll be talking about today. As we, first of all, I'll give an overview of the sort of driving argument of the chapter that we did. And then we'll speak a little bit about the impact that COVID has had on teachers and teaching. So to begin, I think the driving motivation for writing this chapter for the four of us is that we were sort of watching this shift from a focus on access and, improving enrollments in the Millennium Development Goals, in the Education for All goal. And so, with quite a lot of hope and optimism that there was an increased emphasis on actually improving quality, alongside, importantly, inclusion and equity. But quality seems to be defined often quite narrowly in terms of learning outcomes. As Will was mentioning, we're looking at testing at results on tests as if somehow this is going to tell us something about the quality of learning. And then we see a greater interest in teachers and teaching, but it seems again quite sort of narrowly defined in terms of a way of improving learning outcomes. So obviously this makes sense, right? You need somebody who's actually going to drive up these learning outcomes. So what happened was we got an indicator about teachers in SDG 4. And this target, it was the last of 10, so hopefully not an afterthought, but who knows. And it was one of these means of implementation targets. So what the actual target is to substantially increase the supply of qualified teachers, including through international cooperation for teacher training in developing countries, and then especially these least developed countries. There was a lot of umming and ahhing back and forth about how we actually go about measuring this target, a lot of important work that went into saying maybe we need it a little bit broader than just saying qualified. So we ended up with sort of global and thematic indicators on how many teachers are qualified, how many are trained, motivation levels, and how they're supported. Now, we identified a persistent problem, which is that, first of all, target 4C is the only one of 10 to explicitly mention teachers, and that teachers are referred to in very reductive terms. I know Elaine was saying that it would be good to recognize the university one as a means of implementation, but when you're only a means of implementation, when you're only a supply, it starts to feel a little bit reductive. So we see this as something that continues to dominate the discourse. And what's particularly frustrating about this is that this simplistic view doesn't actually even help us achieve better data coverage. Because, for example, we still don't have estimates for the percentage of secondary school teachers with the minimum qualifications in sub-Saharan Africa. We don't have estimates for lower upper secondary separately since 2011. And actually, fewer than 1 in 4 countries report distinct values from qualified teachers and trained teachers. So the central argument of our chapter, we explored 3 sort of key questions. And I think one of them, I mean, we're not the first people to say this, we certainly didn't coin it, but the idea that we need to learn how to actually measure what we treasure. We can't just start to treasure what's easiest to measure. We also wanted to look at the current SDG indicator framework to see if it actually does a decent job in terms of measuring progress when it comes to teachers. And we wanted to see what some of the key barriers were and the potential catalysts were for meaningful measurement of teachers. And that's important. It has to be meaningful. And I think we build on this idea that, yeah, again, we need to bring the human back into this, that it's one thing to talk about learner-centered or learning-centered education and how important it is to put the learner at the center. But actually, we need to do some teacher-centered planning as well, because teachers are active stakeholders in education. And not just that, they are also human beings in their own right. They may face discrimination, they may face rights violations themselves. And actually, if they're adequately supported, not only do you have the benefit of actually meeting the human rights obligations to a group of people, but they themselves can then be these powerful agents of education reform and sustainable development. So turning to the impact of COVID-19 on teachers, sadly, I think it wasn't unexpected for a lot of us who work on teachers, but there wasn't much. We turn to the SDG 4 page on the UN SDGs, and you will see an overview, the overview slide, right, which says, okay, this is the goal, and then it has a handy little tab before COVID. And it talked about, yes, the progress to inclusive and equitable quality education was too slow. Talked about numbers of out-of-school children, and still the trajectory will continue in 2030. Then the COVID implications. I looked at those and I thought, but who's doing this, right? Remote learning remains out of reach, but what about remote teaching? School closures kept students out of school. What were the teachers doing? Where were the teachers? What's happening in terms of school completion? Who wasn't having their salary paid? Who wasn't able to take care of their family? One that's sort of related, but basic hand washing facilities. Yes, an extremely important indicator, but nothing here around teachers. So now I'll turn it over to Bilal because he'll speak a little bit more about the progress in terms of actually measuring target 4C before looking at what if some of the other issues are facing teachers today.
Thank you, Stephanie. And so looking here at what the SDG progress report said in 2020, we see that it talks about this sort of very elementary lowest common denominator kind of indicator of the percentage of teachers who receive the minimum training according to national standards. And as we already mentioned, even these numbers for sub-Saharan Africa, if we weren't talking about primary here, but other levels, we wouldn't even have those numbers current from the last couple of years. And even these numbers are based on a lot of imputation, because for a lot of countries, we don't even have those numbers, right? So these regional averages, there's a lot of estimation going on even there. And now when we look at when we preview the content of the 2021 SDG progress report, we'll see there's more of that. And then we learn that the teaching workforce was severely affected by COVID, whatever that means. Right? And we do actually know something about that means. We all do, from various sources that each one of us individually has access to through our own schools, the schooling of our family members and the teachers there, media and so on. We know that teachers indisputably are frontline workers, but we also know that in many places they were not recognized as such if we look at sort of hard recognition in terms of vaccination priority, for example. We know, and I'll show some of the results underlining this, that there was pressure to maintain learning continuity, but there was very little support in many cases for teachers to actually achieve that. And if ever there was a time to argue in favor of smaller class sizes, even right now, never mind the pedagogical value and the contentious debates around where diminishing returns set in. But when we're talking about having reduced capacity in all other indoor settings and needing to only have someone sitting in every other seat, the most obvious way would be to actually have smaller classes, and this means you need more teachers for that. But even within this context, where really there was every reason to reduce class sizes and hire more teachers, even we'll see that happen to a very limited extent only. This is not a strategy many countries were investing in much at all. So in contrast with that, sorry, just back, I skipped over the box here. I'm skipping back to it now in a way. So really, we think that our chapter, read in the light of the developments we've seen with respect to the COVID-19 response, really highlights some of the things that should be questioned there, and highlights that we should instead be talking a lot more about teacher-centered planning and putting teachers at the center of sort of planning for an equitable, inclusive quality of recovery. Thank you. Next slide. Now, one of the sources of information we have on what countries are actually doing in response to COVID-19 is from a joint survey administered. The third wave has been administered and is being analyzed now by UNESCO, UNICEF, the World Bank. And just some of the snippets there relating to teachers. This is not a survey specifically about teacher policy. This is a sort of comprehensive, a whole menu of policy responses. But reassuringly, there are actually quite a few questions relating specifically to teachers there. And they do pick up some of the issues that we mentioned in the chapter are sort of missing from the bread and butter pre-COVID SDG monitoring framework with respect to teachers, and go into much more detail, or attempt to go into more detail, looking at the teaching environment, the safety of the teaching environment, the support, the specific support teachers are getting, and so on. So that's a positive development on the data front in terms of what data are actually being collected. But we see that what the data are telling us is not a rosy picture. So one thing already mentioned, very few countries were even looking at recruiting additional teachers under these circumstances. Only barely 2/3 of countries have adequate resources and infrastructure to ensure a safe teaching and learning environment. And as we'll see on the next slide, if we look beyond just providing instructions and content for remote learning, if you look at the far right here, you have the world average of the percentage of countries who reported having provided certain forms of support to teachers. You'll see that instructions for sort of remote learning and teaching under COVID, that reached just over 60%, and just over half of countries reported providing support in terms of actually providing special content for remote learning. But then as we go further and look at special training, even training just for ICT tools and internet, we're down to sort of just a third of countries who did something like that. And if you go one sort of sub-panel to the left and look at the figures for sub-Saharan Africa, and I want to highlight the professional psychosocial support. We're talking about 4% of countries provided professional psychosocial support to teachers in the region. So we have data now, and it's good that really there was no way of closing one's eyes and denying that these kinds of questions had to be asked in the COVID situation. But some of the results are disappointing, to say the least. Another source of information we have, so the previous data based on surveys sent to countries and responded to by countries. We also have findings of sort of coming from teachers themselves. The current iteration of the Global Status of Teachers report, which there hasn't been, I believe we're not going to wait much longer for this, but others here on the panel can maybe tell us more about that. But you know, what do we find? We find that there is too little support. There's a recognition, teachers recognize that this is not an investment priority. This chimes resonates with some of the results we saw earlier that we didn't include here, about teachers not getting paid. Very, very few countries actually considered paying a bonus to teachers for the extra work and the extra effort. Limited psychosocial support. All these things you can actually find, but this is not just speculation, but this is what teachers will tell you. And interestingly, in a way, given that the SDG 4 monitoring framework pre-COVID is very concerned with supply, there is actually surprisingly little concern or quantified concern about what the current situation will actually do to teacher attrition and what this and beyond, and what this will mean for the ability of countries to hire sufficiently many well-motivated teachers in the future. In the current situation, what's the motivation for a school leaver to actually embark on a teaching career? We see very little of those kinds of discussions, never mind data on that. Next slide. So reflecting on the thinking we did for the chapter and on what this implies for the current situation, it's clear that we do need new kinds of data, new kinds of indicators, and some of that, as I said, it has been recognized and is now being collected. So we're not just talking about percentage who received some professional development of some kind in the last 12 months, but we're looking much more, in much greater detail about teachers receiving support and training on remote teaching, for example, specifically, and so on. There, because the role of teachers simply couldn't be denied in the present situation, perhaps there has been sort of an impetus, a stimulus to teacher advocacy, especially early on, at least speaking from my experience in Europe, especially last year during the first lockdown, when many families were suddenly facing a homeschooling situation. There was more talk of recognizing suddenly what's actually involved in the difficulties of teaching, the difficulties of teaching your own kid, even, and that maybe some of that hasn't always been the teacher's fault after all. We don't know how much of that will carry over. And as we say, it hasn't really translated into hard currency of support necessarily until now, but that's potentially the silver lining, if there is one. With that, we welcome your questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Bilal and Stephanie. And there's been a few questions, and I'm wondering if this attrition question is maybe one that we could stay with. There's been a few questions around how do we make teachers more central? How do we ensure that teachers stay in the profession? We have some incredible, and had already before the onset of COVID-19, with crazy statistics around the number of teachers that we're considering leaving the profession. So brief thoughts from the two of you on what could be done.
Well, I will respond briefly, and then maybe Bilal can pick up. I think from my perspective, it is that, I mean, it sounds a little bit cheesy to say recognizing teachers as human, but I think it's really important that we're not just thinking about numbers of teachers, but that we're thinking about teachers' lifetimes. We're thinking about teacher careers. And if you start that, like logically speaking, you're actually looking at all of these targets of targets 1 through 7, they're all referring to people who might grow up one day and become teachers in their communities. And so they're really thinking about investing in teaching as thinking about that broad trajectory, starting from when kids are little, and then investing means investing from day one, and then thinking about the opportunities for career progression, even as you are dealing with a crisis, thinking about what does this actually mean, and also then just the feeling valued. Even it's not always pay. I mean, it often ends up when you're doing those research studies involving teachers, one of the questions will always come in, well, our salaries aren't very good. But I think it's a much more nuanced answer. And actually, if you ask teachers themselves, it's about a lot more than that, that you can actually put up with a pretty shady salary sometimes if you actually feel like you're doing something, if you actually feel like the work that you're doing is valued. So I think having some way of costing that whole trajectory, teachers over the lifespan, really, I think would go a long way. And I'm sure Bilal has some thoughts as well.
Thanks. Yes, I mean, just to add, because I agree with everything you said there. So I'm looking at the TALIS 2018 data at the moment, and unfortunately I haven't analyzed that question yet in a way that I could share, but there are actually questions in there, and I'm sure in other surveys on whether teaching was a first choice of career, what motivates teachers. There's even a question on what teachers themselves would suggest an increase in the education budget at the national level should be spent on. Increasing teacher salaries is one of those options, but there are other answer options there. And as I said, unfortunately, I don't have those numbers yet, and maybe someone has already looked at what's in the TALIS report on those issues. But there are ways, so even the limited ways of trying to get a better grip on what actually motivates teachers or what they say motivates them, we're not fully exploiting that yet. And especially, so you know, TAL is quite a few countries, but it's very far from being sort of globally representative. So perhaps there is a need for more research of that kind, and maybe linking with Elaine's point of, you know, really connecting with higher education, teacher training institutions in low and low middle income countries, where, especially where there are teacher shortages, of making sure that we really have that local knowledge of why is attrition that high, what motivates the school leavers who do enter teaching, and so on. And when we know more about that, I think we can make much more informed sort of policy decisions around how to retain them and how to motivate them.
Thanks to you both. And I think that raises a very interesting question around SDG 4 as somehow having represented a global promise, a global commitment to giving us that data. And as Will pointed out, there's been very few indicators that have had the money and political will that has got us to methodology as well as data. And currently, that is the narrow literacy and numeracy global proficiency indicators. And that is something that we as an education community should be incredibly concerned about and worked up about, and really on the barricades, fighting for more and better implementation of SDG 4 as a whole. We are running out of time. That does suggest, though, that we've had a great exchange. Unfortunately, it means that panelists will have to respond to some of the questions in the chat. As I'm going to hand over to our discussant, Hugh McLean from the Open Society Foundations. And after Hugh, I think Moira will do a quick wrap up from NORRAG's side. And then the good news is, of course, that we can continue the conversation on Thursday. Hugh, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, look, I really enjoyed that. And you really opened up enormous, really big questions, and they're persisting questions, I think, in our field and for us politically. So they're really important ones, and there's really, in fact, no time to do them justice. And I don't want to keep you. I'd love to respond in more detail, but perhaps I'd just pick up on one or two things and then get back to you, Moira and Antonia. When you started the session, Moira, you said that the key thing was about generating participation around these issues. I think the key thing around SDG 4 was the level of participation that the education community broadly, the level of communication was quite of communication and engagement around that goal was really important. And because of that, I think the idea of just jettisoning most of it and focusing on narrow aspects of it is a problematic thing for us to be doing if we're going to be taking global goals and targets really seriously. But the other thing I think that you mentioned, Antonia, and all of the speakers, I think in one way or another really illustrated this, was that somehow COVID was this an interruption that we've had a pause, but now things are resetting themselves, and everything that happened before was either deepened before COVID, but he's carrying on pretty much the same way. And the agendas that we've seen that have reestablished themselves were actually set quite a long while back. It's whether the one about narrowing, whether it comes to teachers, or the way that metrics have narrowed things down. Those are old agendas, and they are agendas that were set politically with economic and political ideas in mind. And they have, I think, persisted through the COVID period. All of us will remember about a year ago, there was that window where there was a sense that somehow with COVID, there was a possibility for new realizations about what's important. It was teachers, it was the public good that you mentioned, Elaine, how these things suddenly came forward, how we realized how important that was to engage with one another in a more everyday sense, in a deeper sense. And that was, I think, lost pretty quickly as other ideas and debates came to the fore. And then also the thing about online, it being, while it might be some success for the people that attend at higher ed, for most of children in school, I think there was a sense of the total inadequacy of that environment, not only unequal, but even for children that did have the access, it's just not possible to sit and look at a computer and concentrate the whole day. And the narrowing of the education experience, even where there were resources for people to see. So, and there was that wonderful, Ranabir Samadar has this wonderful idea about how the quarantine turned us from the quarantine units, in fact, behind computers, has somehow turned the COVID was able to turn that into units that were economically and socially productive in different ways. And I think we've seen the transforming of a lot of the assumptions, but also the questioning of them. And this, for me, I think raises the central question that all of you touched on in different ways, and all of the chapters touch on in the book, which I've had occasion to look at again. You can't really see it because of my backdrop, but there you go. And that is the question of accountability. And I think what we've seen in this debate actually is the whole broader picture about reducing accountability for those who are actually accountable, those in governance and those who run systems, and trying somehow to increase accountability at the level of the teacher, at the level of the individual responsibility of the teachers or of families who are somehow supposedly to get through all of this. So I think you've raised some important questions, and what it gets back to in the end, of course, is if we are to have a new conversation about education, how do we really transform that debate? This book's a start. Our discussion about the book, our discussion around about the epidemic and how to respond is a start. But the real question is how we transform that debate fundamentally, and not have a debate that is on familiar turf with a tail wagging the dog about indicators and the narrowness of the indicators being the only ones that we can measure, therefore the only ones we should be measuring. And then also when we're looking even at higher ed, you know, we speak about general education and higher education as if that's all there is to education. Sometimes we mention lifelong learning, but we forget about the youngsters in vocational ed, and of course those out of school, and all of the informal education options. I think that people have been turning to more and more readily and out of necessity. So there's a huge amount here. I'm going to leave it right there for all of you, and we'll look forward to continuing some more of the same on this Thursday for the next debate that's coming up. So thank you very much, everyone, and thanks to NORRAG for organizing it and pulling this together so well.
Thank you very much, Hugh and Antonia, for a fabulous beginning to the conversation. As you've both said, we do continue this conversation Thursday, same time. It is a different Zoom link, so do make sure that you go to your calendar or your email and find the right link to come. And do take another look at this very important book. And you've seen it there. There's a link in the chat where you can click through, and we really do look forward to seeing you again on Thursday. Thank you all so much. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.